Welcome to Historian I.F. Knight. We begin with one of the strangest and most unsettling jobs of the 19th century, the life of a Victorian baker. At first glance, it sounds harmless. Baking bread, after all, is one of the oldest and most comforting professions in human history. But in Victorian Britain, baking bread was not just hard work. It was dangerous, even deadly, both for the bakers themselves and for the unsuspecting people who bought their loaves. Bread was the staple of life in 19th century England. Poor families often spent more than half their income on bread alone. It filled stomachs when meat or vegetables were too expensive, and it was eaten with nearly every meal. Because of this, bakers held an enormous responsibility. The quality of bread directly affected the health of millions. But in a world without modern food safety laws, profit often outweighed responsibility, and bread became one of the most adulterated foods in the entire Victorian diet. The problem began with flour. Good flour made from pure wheat was costly, and bakers looking to stretch their profits often mixed it with fillers. Chalk, ground bones, plaster of Paris, even powdered alum, a chemical compound containing aluminum, were added to whiten bread and make it look more refined. White bread was seen as a mark of quality, a luxury compared to darker loaves eaten by the poor. But that whiteness came at a deadly cost. Alum in particular caused digestive problems, stomach cramps, and long-term damage to health. Children who ate alum-laced bread suffered stunted growth, and adults often endured chronic pain without realizing the bread itself was to blame. One report from the Victorian Web notes that some bakers even mixed in toxic compounds like lead. In the infamous Bradford sweets poisoning of 1858, lead-contaminated materials used in sugar led to the deaths of more than 20 people and sickened hundreds. Though that incident involved candy, not bread, it exposed a much larger issue. Victorian food was filled with adulterants, and bread was no exception. Bakers were quietly dosing their customers with substances that slowly poisoned them, all in the pursuit of cheaper production and higher profit. Working conditions in the bakeries themselves were equally grim. Bakeries were hot, cramped, and poorly ventilated. The ovens roared day and night, filling the air with flour dust and smoke. Bakers often began work at midnight and labored until dawn, with little rest and constant exposure to lung-clogging particles. Chronic respiratory illness was so common among bakers that it became known simply as baker as lung. Add to this the burns, cuts, and sheer exhaustion of endless manual labor, and the job was far from romantic. Attempts to regulate the trade came slowly. The Making of Bread Act of 1757 was one of the first efforts to curb adulteration, but enforcement was weak. By the Victorian era, scandals and public outcry pushed Parliament to pass new laws. The Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, inspired in part by disasters like the Bradford poisoning, made it illegal to tamper with food. Yet even after these reforms, enforcement remained uneven. Inspectors were few, penalties were light, and bakers continued to cut corners when they thought no one was watching. For the bakers themselves, the dangers were double. Not only did they inhale flour dust and risk burns from massive brick ovens, they also handled the very chemicals that sickened their customers. Alum, plaster, chalk, these powders clung to their hands, their clothes, their lungs. The baker's shop, supposedly a place of warmth and nourishment, could be a slow-moving death trap. And yet, bread remained essential. Families lined up for loaves every morning, unaware of what had been mixed into them. To be a Victorian baker was to hold a strange kind of power. You fed your community, but you also poisoned it, whether by choice, by ignorance, or by the cruel demands of profit in an industrial age. So the next time you picture the cozy life of a 19th century baker, imagine instead the midnight shift, the choking dust, the glowing oven doors, and the secret handful of powder stirred into the flour. A profession that should have been wholesome and sustaining instead became one of the most quietly dangerous jobs of its time. Now that we've finished with the dangerous world of Victorian bakers, let's drift back much further in time, to the marble streets of ancient Rome. Tonight, we'll follow the life of one of history's most famous figures, a man whose name became a title, whose ambition reshaped the ancient world, and whose death shook an empire, Julius Caesar. Caesar was born in 100 BC into the patrician Julian clan, a family that claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas, the Trojan hero. His childhood was not surrounded by luxury, as we might imagine. His family had noble roots, but they were not among the wealthiest of Rome. What he did inherit was a name of distinction, and from the very beginning, Caesar grew up with the sense that he was destined for something greater. In his youth, Rome was not yet an empire, but a republic, a complex system of senators, magistrates, and generals, where power was always shifting and alliances were fragile. Caesar's early years were marked by turbulence. At 16, his father died suddenly, and the young Julius became head of the household. He was already being trained in the arts of rhetoric, law, and military discipline, preparing him for a public career. But Caesar's path was almost cut short. The dictator Sulla, who had seized power in Rome, ordered Caesar to divorce his wife Cornelia, the daughter of one of Sulla's rivals. Caesar refused. It was an act of defiance that could have cost him his life. Stripped of his inheritance, threatened with execution, he fled the city and lived in hiding. Only through the pleas of his family did Sulla reluctantly pardon him. As Sulla is said to have remarked, "There are many Mariuses in Caesar." It was a warning. This young man could become dangerous. After Sulla's death, Caesar returned to Rome and began his public career. He studied law, spoke persuasively in court, and gained a reputation as a bold orator. But it was in the military that he first made his mark. Serving in Asia Minor, Caesar fought bravely and even won the civic crown, one of Rome's highest military honors, for saving a fellow soldier in battle. He was ambitious, charming, and unafraid of risk, qualities that would define his rise. In his 30s, Caesar held a series of political offices: quaestor, aedile, praetor. He used every step to build alliances and gain popularity. As aedile, he spent lavishly on public games and spectacles, plunging himself into debt but winning the favor of the people. This was Caesar's strategy, to court the masses with generosity while carefully weaving himself into Rome's political web. Then came his first major turning point, his governorship in Spain. There, he commanded troops, crushed rebellions, and enriched himself. But more importantly, he tasted the independence of power. Returning to Rome in 60 BCE, he struck a deal that would change history, the First Triumvirate. Alongside Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, and Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, Caesar formed an unofficial alliance. Together, they controlled politics, wealth, and the army. With their support, Caesar secured the consulship in 59 BCE, and shortly after, he was appointed governor of Gaul. It was in Gaul that Caesar's legend was truly born. Over the course of nearly a decade, he led campaigns that expanded Rome's territory all the way to the English Channel. His commentaries on the Gallic War not only described these battles, but also served as political propaganda, portraying Caesar as Rome's tireless defender. His victories brought him immense wealth, loyalty from his soldiers, and unrivaled popularity back in Rome. But alliances never last forever. Crassus was killed in battle, and tensions with Pompey grew. The Senate, fearing Caesar's ambition, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome. Instead, in 49 BCE, Caesar made his fateful choice. Crossing the Rubicon River with his legion, he uttered the words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. With that act of defiance, civil war began. The war between Caesar and Pompey was swift and brutal. Pompey fled to Greece, and though he raised a vast army, Caesar outmaneuvered him. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Caesar triumphed. Pompey escaped to Egypt, but there he was betrayed and assassinated, leaving Caesar the master of Rome. In Egypt, Caesar became entangled with Queen Cleopatra, forging both a political and romantic alliance. Their partnership produced a son, Caesarion, and bound Caesar's destiny not just to Rome, but to the ancient world of the Nile. Returning to Rome, he embarked on reforms, redistributing land, reforming the calendar, reducing debt, and strengthening central authority. He was hailed as dictator, first temporarily, then for 10 years, and finally, dictator for life. But absolute power breeds resentment. Senators whispered that Caesar aimed to make himself king, a title Romans despised since the expulsion of their last monarch centuries earlier. The final blow came on the Ides of March, 44 BCE. A group of conspirators, including men Caesar trusted like Brutus and Cassius, stabbed him in the Senate chamber. According to tradition, Caesar fell beneath Pompey's statue, his blood staining the very place that symbolized the republic he had overturned. His last words, whether truly "et tu, Brute," or something else, remain debated. Caesar's death did not restore the republic. Instead, it plunged Rome into another series of civil wars that ended with his adopted heir, Octavian, rising as Augustus, Rome's first emperor. In this sense, Caesar did not just end the republic, he laid the foundation for the empire that followed. So, what do we make of him? To some, Caesar was a tyrant who destroyed liberty. To others, he was a visionary who reshaped Rome and left legacies that endure to this day. From the Julian calendar to the very word Caesar, which became synonymous with emperor. His life was one of brilliance, ambition, and tragedy, a story that continues to echo through history. And as we let the story fade into the quiet, picture the marble columns of Rome in twilight, the forum emptying, the torches flickering low. The man who once commanded legions now rests only in memory, his name still whispered across centuries. Julius Caesar, a reminder that greatness and downfall often walk hand in hand. As we leave behind the ambitions of Julius Caesar, let's drift even further back, to the hot sun and stony hills of ancient Greece. Tonight, we'll walk through the dusty fields of Olympia, where one of the most enduring traditions of human history began, the Olympic Games. These games were more than sport. They were religion, ritual, spectacle, and community all at once, and they shaped the very identity of the ancient Greek world. The story begins not with athletes, but with the gods. The Olympics were held in honor of Zeus, the king of the gods, whose great temple stood at Olympia in the Peloponnese. Every 4 years, starting in 776 BCE by traditional reckoning, men from across the Greek world would gather to compete, not only for personal glory, but as an act of devotion. Victors did not win gold medals or money at first. They won olive wreaths, symbols of Zeus's favor, and the eternal memory of being named the best among Greeks. Imagine the journey. Athletes from city-states as far away as Athens, Corinth, or even the Greek colonies in Asia Minor would travel to Olympia. Roads filled with travelers, not just competitors, but merchants, poets, priests, and spectators eager to take part in the sacred festival. Wars were paused, thanks to the Olympic truce, a declaration that allowed safe passage for all who came to the games. For a brief moment in time, enemies laid down their arms so they could gather in peace. The games themselves were simple at first. In the earliest records, there was only one event, the stadium race, a sprint of about 200 meters, named for the length of the stadium. The winner of that first recorded race in 776 BCE was a cook named Coroebus of Elis. His name was remembered not because he fought a war or ruled a city, but because he ran faster than anyone else that year. It was a small beginning, but it carried the seeds of something monumental. Over the centuries, more events were added. Wrestling, boxing, the pancration, a brutal mix of wrestling and striking with almost no rules, and the pentathlon, which tested athletes in running, jumping, discus, javelin, and wrestling. Chariot racing became one of the most spectacular contests, held in the hippodrome, where crashes were common and victory brought not only fame, but sometimes political power. The games were as much about spectacle as they were about sport. Crowds filled the dusty hillsides to watch, cheering for their city's champions. Poets wrote verses celebrating victors, and statues were erected to honor those who achieved greatness. To win at Olympia was to secure immortality in Greek culture, a fame that would follow a man for the rest of his life. But the Olympics were not just about athletics. They were deeply religious. Before the games began, athletes took oaths before the altar of Zeus, swearing to follow the rules. Sacrifices were made, feasts were held, and processions honored the gods. The Temple of Zeus housed one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a massive gold and ivory statue of the god, seated on his throne, watching over the contests. To compete at Olympia was to stand not just before your fellow Greeks, but before Zeus himself. The games also served as a stage for politics. City-states sent their best athletes, hoping to demonstrate their strength and prestige. Victories were claimed as symbols of the city's power. In some cases, generals or kings sponsored chariots, and when they won, the glory reflected on the ruler, not the driver. Even amid the sacred truce, rivalry simmered, and the games became an extension of the endless competition that defined Greek politics. Life for the athletes was grueling. Training could last for months in the gymnasia, where men exercised naked. The Greek word gymnos means nude, and perfected their techniques. Diets were carefully planned, with athletes consuming bread, cheese, olives, and later meat to fuel their bodies. Trainers and coaches played a crucial role, and some became famous in their own right. The pursuit of excellence, what the Greeks called arete, was central. To strive, to struggle, to reach the peak of human ability, this was the purpose of the games. Yet for all their ideals, the Olympics were not without controversy. Cheating existed, whether through bribery or tricks during events. Those caught were fined, and their names recorded on bronze statues called zanes, set up as warnings against dishonesty. Even in the ancient world, the temptation to bend the rules for victory was never far away. The games grew in importance until they became a unifying symbol of Greek identity. Every 4 years, no matter what wars raged or rivalries burned, the Greeks returned to Olympia. The cycle of competition linked generations, creating a rhythm of history that lasted for over 1,000 years. But nothing lasts forever. As Rome absorbed Greece into its empire, the games continued but changed in character. Wealthy Romans sometimes participated, and the sacred meaning slowly eroded. By the 4th century CE, as Christianity spread, the old pagan rituals lost favor. In 393 CE, the Emperor Theodosius officially banned the Olympic Games, calling them a relic of paganism. The sacred flame was extinguished, the stadium fell silent, and the once great festival faded into ruins. And yet, the memory endured. When the modern Olympic Games were revived in 1896, it was Olympia that provided the inspiration, linking the world's greatest sporting event to its ancient origins. The dream of excellence, of unity, of peaceful competition had been born in that dusty Greek valley so many centuries before. So as we close our eyes tonight, picture yourself beneath the olive trees of Olympia. The air is hot and dry, the crowd is restless, and the runners line up at the starting line, ready to sprint into history. The torchlight flickers, the altar of Zeus looms nearby, and for a moment, all of Greece is united in watching men strive for glory. The sound of sandals slapping the earth echoes, and the first Olympic Games begin, not just a contest, but a tradition that would echo through the ages. Now let us shift our attention from the olive groves of Greece to the marble palaces and narrow alleys of Renaissance Florence. Tonight's story is about a family whose name has become a byword for wealth, power, and influence, the Medici. Their rise from modest beginnings to rulers of Florence and patrons of some of the greatest art the world has ever known is one of the most remarkable sagas in European history. The story begins not with kings or knights, but with merchants. The Medici were originally from the Mugello region of Tuscany, north of Florence. By the 13th century, they had moved into the city and established themselves as bankers and traders. Florence itself was a place of opportunity, a city built on wool, textiles, and finance, buzzing with energy, conflict, and ambition. In such a place, a clever and determined family could climb quickly, and that is exactly what the Medici did. The turning point came in the 14th century with Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. Giovanni was cautious, pragmatic, and shrewd. He built the Medici Bank into one of the most successful financial institutions in Europe. Unlike some of his rivals, he avoided risky ventures and cultivated good relationships with powerful clients. His most important connection was the papacy. By managing the finances of the church, Giovanni secured influence that reached far beyond Florence. When he died in 1429, he left his sons not just wealth, but a foundation of power that would support generations to come. It was Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, later called Cosimo the Elder, who truly brought the family to prominence. Cosimo inherited his father's fortune and expanded both the bank and the family's influence in Florentine politics. Florence was a republic, at least in name, with power theoretically shared among its citizens. In practice, however, factions and wealthy families dominated the government. Cosimo mastered the art of ruling from behind the scenes. He rarely held official titles for long, but he controlled Florence through alliances, patronage, and a network of supporters. Cosimo also understood something that would define the Medici legacy: the power of culture. He spent lavishly on architecture, libraries, and art. He supported scholars who revived classical learning, helped finance the construction of Florence's great cathedral dome designed by Brunelleschi, and collected manuscripts that preserved ancient knowledge. His patronage made Florence a center of the Renaissance and ensured that the Medici name was associated not only with money, but with the rebirth of civilization itself. When Cosimo died in 1464, he was hailed as Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland. His family's place in Florentine life was secure, but it was his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, who took their fame to dazzling heights. Lorenzo ruled Florence with charisma and skill. He was a poet, a patron, and a statesman, deeply involved in both politics and culture. Under his leadership, Florence became a beacon of art and learning. He supported artists like Botticelli, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci, ensuring that the Renaissance flourished. But Lorenzo's time was not without danger. The Pazzi family, rivals of the Medici, plotted to assassinate him in 1478. During Mass in the cathedral, Lorenzo was attacked, and his brother Giuliano was killed. Lorenzo himself escaped with only wounds, and the plot collapsed. The aftermath was brutal. Conspirators were hunted down and executed, and Lorenzo emerged even stronger. The failed coup confirmed the Medici dominance over Florence, though it also revealed the constant envy and hostility their power inspired. The Medici story is also one of exile and return. After Lorenzo's death in 1492, the family's hold weakened. Savonarola, a fiery Dominican preacher, rose in Florence, denouncing the corruption and excesses of the city. He drove the Medici out, and for a time, Florence was ruled by religious zeal. But even this did not last. The Medici would return once again, proving their resilience. In the 16th century, their power reached new heights. Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X, using the papacy to enrich his family and promote Renaissance art. Later, Another Medici, Giulio, became Pope Clement VII. Under their patronage, Rome saw some of its greatest artistic achievements, including work by Raphael and Michelangelo. The Medici were no longer just Florentine rulers. They were central players on the stage of European politics. Eventually, the Medici transitioned from merchants and bankers to dukes and monarchs. In 1537, Cosimo I da Medici consolidated power and was recognized as Duke of Florence, later becoming Grand Duke of Tuscany. His reign marked the transformation of the Medici from powerful citizens into hereditary rulers. The family's dynasty would continue to dominate Tuscany for nearly 2 centuries. The Medici legacy is complex. On the one hand, they were ruthless, ambitious, and willing to manipulate politics for their gain. On the other, they were extraordinary patrons of art and learning. Without their support, the Renaissance as we know it might have looked very different. They funded the construction of churches and palaces, the creation of masterpieces, and the preservation of classical texts. In doing so, they shaped not only Florence, but the cultural heritage of the entire Western world. By the 18th century, the Medici line came to an end, but their mark was indelible. The Uffizi Gallery, the great works of Michelangelo and Botticelli, the libraries filled with classical knowledge. All of these stand as monuments to their vision. So as you drift into sleep tonight, picture the streets of Florence under the soft glow of lantern light. Imagine the palaces of the Medici, filled with marble, paintings, and the quiet hum of power. Picture Lorenzo surrounded by poets and artists, or Cosimo quietly pulling the strings of government. The Medici were not kings in name, but they were rulers in practice, leaving behind a legacy that still whispers through the stones of Florence. Now that we've wandered through the grandeur of Florence and the world of the Medici, let's drift back to the soot-filled streets of Victorian England, where food, something so ordinary, so essential to life, was often a hidden threat. The Victorian era, a time of rapid industrial growth, crowded cities, and endless innovation, was also a time when food safety was almost non-existent. Tonight, we'll talk about the dark side of Victorian diets, when adulteration and poison lurked in the marketplace, and every loaf of bread, every sweet, every pint of milk might carry danger. Imagine stepping into a Victorian marketplace. The stalls are crowded, the smell of coal smoke lingers in the air, and merchants shout their wares. Bread, vegetables, sweets, meat, and milk are laid out for sale. But behind the appearance of abundance lies a truth. Much of this food was altered, stretched, or even poisoned. With little regulation and fierce competition, sellers often mixed cheap or harmful substances into their products to cut costs and increase profit. The customer might never know until it was too late. Bread, the staple of the poor, was one of the worst offenders. We already spoke of bakers who sometimes used alum, a chalky white powder, to make bread look whiter and more expensive than it really was. Alum caused digestive problems and weakened those who ate it regularly. But alum was not the only additive. Some bakers bulked up their flour with ground bones, chalk, or even plaster. The poorest families, relying on bread for most of their calories, consumed these adulterated loaves daily, unaware that their food was slowly undermining their health. Milk, too, was not safe. In the crowded cities of London and Manchester, fresh milk spoiled quickly. To make it last, or simply to increase profits, sellers watered it down. Sometimes chalk was added to restore its white color. In some cases, even more sinister substances were used. Formaldehyde, for example, to prevent spoilage. Children, who relied on milk as a staple, were especially vulnerable. Infant mortality rates soared, and though many causes contributed, tainted milk was among them. Sweets, those bright little luxuries enjoyed by children, carried perhaps the deadliest risks. Sugar was expensive, and so unscrupulous sweet makers often added fillers like plaster of Paris or groundstone. To create bright colors, they used toxic chemicals, red dyes made from lead oxide, green sweets colored with arsenic, and yellows from mercury compounds. Children flocked to these treats, their hands sticky and their faces smiling, never knowing that the very colors that made them so tempting were also lethal. One of the most infamous tragedies was the Bradford sweets poisoning of 1858. A confectioner accidentally used arsenic instead of a harmless filler when preparing peppermint lozenges. Over 200 people were poisoned and 21 died. The horror of this event shocked the nation and finally pushed Parliament towards stricter regulation, leading to the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860. Yet even after that, adulteration did not vanish overnight. Beer, another common drink, was often tampered with. Brewers stretched their product with mixtures that included strychnine, a deadly poison, to give beer a sharper taste. Other times, sulfuric acid was added to cheapen fermentation. The working man, ending his day with a pint at the local public house, might be drinking something far more dangerous than he realized. Even tea, that most British of comforts, was at risk. Used tea leaves were sometimes collected, dried, and resold. Some were dyed with Prussian blue or copper salts to restore their green or black appearance. A warm pot of tea might look inviting, but it could easily carry invisible hazards. Fruits and vegetables were not free of risk either. In an age before chemical regulation, pesticides and preservatives were used freely. Apples were polished with lead-based waxes to make them shine. Pickles were given their green color with copper salts. Vinegars sometimes contained sulfuric acid. To the Victorian housewife shopping for her family, the choice was grim. Buy what was available and hope for the best. Doctors and scientists of the time began to raise alarms. Chemists like Arthur Hill Hessel conducted studies in the mid-19th century, analyzing food samples and exposing widespread adulteration. His reports in The Lancet shocked readers, revealing just how many of their daily foods contained dangerous additives. Still, change was slow. Business interests resisted regulation, and many believed that cheap food, however tainted, was better than none at all. The poor bore the greatest burden. Wealthier families could afford better quality food, or at least food from trusted suppliers. The poor, however, had no choice but to purchase the cheapest goods, often the most adulterated. Malnutrition combined with poisoning left many weakened, more vulnerable to disease, and less able to withstand the harsh conditions of industrial life. The Making of Bread Act of 1757 had been an early attempt to regulate, but enforcement was weak. Only in the later 19th century, after repeated scandals like the Bradford poisoning, did stronger laws begin to take hold. The Food Adulteration Acts gradually improved standards, though problems never disappeared completely. As we reflect on the dangers of Victorian food, it's easy to wonder how people survived at all. Yet, in some ways, it was a matter of resilience. Human bodies endured small doses of harmful substances, though at great cost to health and lifespan. Life expectancy was low, but communities continued, families persisted, and slowly, awareness grew. So tonight, as you rest, imagine yourself in a Victorian marketplace. The cobblestones are damp, the air thick with smoke, and merchants call out their prices. You pass stalls of bread, sweets, milk, and beer. The colors are bright, the smells enticing, but behind it all lies uncertainty. Every bite could carry hidden danger, every treat a silent threat. The Victorian era was a time of innovation, but it was also a time when food itself could not be trusted. Let the image fade now, the market stalls growing quiet, the lanterns dimming in the evening mist. For us, food safety is something we take for granted. For them, it was a daily gamble, a reminder that even the simplest things, a loaf of bread, a sweet for a child, a glass of milk, could carry the weight of life and death. As we leave behind the smoke and danger of Victorian food markets, let's travel further back in time, to the banks of the Nile River, Tonight, we enter the world of Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. Her name is one of the most famous in all of history, but beneath the legends and love stories lies the reality of politics, survival, and the slow decline of one of the world's greatest civilizations. Picture Alexandria in the 1st century BCE. It is a city of marble columns, bustling markets, and the great lighthouse shining across the Mediterranean, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. At its heart stood the Library of Alexandria, a place where scrolls from across the known world were gathered. This was the Egypt Cleopatra inherited, a kingdom both magnificent and fragile, rich with history, yet increasingly caught between the rising powers of Rome. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, a daughter of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family of Macedonian Greek origin that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. Unlike many of her ancestors, Cleopatra embraced Egyptian culture. She learned the language, practiced Egyptian religion, and presented herself not only as a Greek queen, but as pharaoh, the living embodiment of the gods. This blending of traditions gave her a unique place in the hearts of her people, but it did not shield her from the storms of politics. The Ptolemaic dynasty was notorious for infighting. Siblings married siblings, alliances shifted, and rivals were eliminated, often violently. Cleopatra herself came to power alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, but their partnership quickly collapsed into civil war. Exiled from Alexandria, Cleopatra returned with determination and a sense for strategy that would define her reign. It was during this time that she forged her most famous alliance with Julius Caesar. Their meeting has been romanticized endlessly, but at its core, it was political. Cleopatra needed support to reclaim her throne, and Caesar, embroiled in Roman conflicts, saw Egypt as both a valuable ally and a personal opportunity. Together, they defeated Ptolemy XIII, and Cleopatra was restored to power. Their relationship produced a son, Caesarion, who Cleopatra hoped might one day unite Egypt and Rome. Cleopatra's reign was not just about her liaisons with Rome, however. She was an able ruler in her own right. She managed Egypt's economy, ensuring the flow of grain that fed not only her people, but also the hungry citizens of Rome. She cultivated trade, encouraged learning, and portrayed herself as the goddess Isis incarnate, blending divine authority with political skill. In a time when female rulers were rare, Cleopatra wielded power with confidence and intelligence. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's future once again hung in the balance. The Roman world descended into chaos, and she needed a new ally. She found one in Mark Antony, one of Caesar's supporters and a man with ambitions of his own. Their partnership was both political and personal, and together they attempted to shape the fate of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra brought ships and troops to Antony's cause. In return, he gave her political recognition and strengthened her position against rivals in Egypt and abroad. Their story has been told as one of romance, but beneath the passion lay hard political calculation. Cleopatra and Antony sought to resist the growing power of Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, who would later become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Their struggle culminated in the famous naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was defeated, and their dream of ruling the Mediterranean collapsed. The end came swiftly. Pursued by Octavian, Cleopatra and Antony retreated to Alexandria. Antony fell on his sword, and Cleopatra, facing capture and humiliation, chose to take her own life, famously through the bite of an asp, though the exact method remains debated. With her death in 30 BCE, Egypt fell to Rome, ending thousands of years of pharaonic rule. Cleopatra's legacy is complicated. Roman writers, especially those loyal to Augustus, painted her as a dangerous seductress, a foreign queen who used her beauty to corrupt noble Romans. This image has endured for centuries, shaping how she is remembered in art, literature, and film. But behind the propaganda, the real Cleopatra emerges, a highly educated woman fluent in several languages, skilled in diplomacy, and determined to protect her kingdom in a world dominated by men and by Rome. Her reign was the last great chapter of ancient Egyptian independence. After her death, Egypt became a Roman province, its grain fields feeding the empire, its monuments admired as relics of a glorious past. Yet Cleopatra herself remained larger than life, a symbol of ambition, resilience, and the tragic intersection of love and power. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine yourself drifting along the Nile at twilight. The river glows gold in the setting sun. Palm trees sway gently in the breeze, and in the distance, the city of Alexandria rises like a jewel of marble and stone. Cleopatra's palace stands near the shore, its torches flickering in the evening light. Inside, the Queen of Egypt plots her next move, balancing love, politics, and the survival of her kingdom. Her story reminds us that history is never simple. It is shaped by human choices, by ambition, by the fragile balance between power and fate. Cleopatra lived at the crossroads of cultures and empires, and though her reign ended in tragedy, her name has never been forgotten. Even now, 2,000 years later, she still holds a place in our imagination, not only as a figure of beauty, but as a ruler who dared to defy the tide of history, if only for a moment. As we leave behind Cleopatra's golden palace on the Nile, we step into a much darker story, one of despair, silence, and survival. Tonight, we journey into the shadow of the 14th century, a time when one of the deadliest diseases in human history swept across continents. This was the Black Death, the plague that killed tens of millions and left scars on Europe and the wider world that would last for centuries. It begins in the year 1347. Trade ships carried goods between east and west, bustling with spices, silk, and grain. But hidden in the holds of those ships were stowaways, black rats and their fleas, carrying the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis. When the ships reached ports like Messina in Sicily, Marseille in France, and Genoa in Italy, they didn't just unload cargo. They unleashed a silent killer. Within weeks, the disease spread like wildfire. The symptoms came quickly and brutally. People developed sudden fevers and chills, followed by painful swellings in the groin, armpits, and neck. These swollen lumps, called buboes, gave the plague its name. Black spots and blotches appeared on the skin, caused by internal bleeding. In many cases, death followed within days. For families and neighbors, there was little they could do but watch in fear. Chroniclers described unimaginable scenes. Giovanni Boccaccio, living in Florence, wrote of how entire families abandoned one another, parents leaving children, husbands and wives separating, so terrified of infection that love itself could not overcome the fear. In Paris, records show 800 people dying each day at the height of the plague. In London, corpses filled churchyards so quickly that mass graves were dug, trenches into which bodies were laid side by side, row after row, until they were covered and forgotten. It is estimated that between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. No war, no famine, no disaster had ever killed so many so quickly. But it was not just Europe. The plague spread to North Africa, to the Middle East, and across Asia. In Cairo, it is said that thousands died each day, with mosques overflowing with funerals. In Damascus, the great historian Ibn Battuta described the city falling silent, its bustling markets closed, its streets emptied by death. From the bustling cities of Persia to the plains of Central Asia, the Black Death left its mark everywhere it traveled. People searched desperately for answers. Science and medicine of the time had no understanding of bacteria or germs. Many believed the plague was God's punishment for sin. Others blamed bad air, what they called miasma, or unusual alignments of the planets. And tragically, scapegoats were found. In parts of Europe, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. Pogroms followed, with entire communities destroyed in acts of violence born from fear and ignorance. Doctors did what they could, but their tools were powerless. Bloodletting, strange diets, burning herbs, none of it made a difference. Some advised carrying sweet-smelling flowers to ward off the bad air, a practice that may have inspired the children's rhyme Ring Around the Rosie. The image of the plague doctor, with his long bird-like mask stuffed with herbs, would become iconic later, though at the time it was rare. Still, the sight of these doctors in their eerie masks lingers in our imagination, a symbol of helplessness dressed up as science. The economic impact was staggering. With so many dead, farms were abandoned and harvests rotted in the fields. Labor became scarce, and for the first time, peasants found themselves with bargaining power. Wages rose, and the old feudal order began to crack. In England, decades later, this shift helped fuel the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when common people demanded more freedom and fairness. In some ways, the plague accelerated social change, breaking apart systems that had lasted for centuries. Culturally, the Black Death left deep scars. Art and literature became filled with images of death. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, appeared across Europe, paintings and carvings showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life, from kings to peasants to their graves. It was a reminder that death came for everyone, rich or poor, noble or humble. Churches filled with frescoes of judgment, warning the living of life's fragility. Religion itself was shaken. For many, the church's inability to stop the plague weakened faith. Priests died in huge numbers, and people began to question the authority of those who claimed to speak for God. But for others, the catastrophe deepened devotion. Flagellant movements appeared, groups of men who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves in penance, believing their suffering might persuade God to end the plague. For some, the plague was not just a disease, but a test of faith. Burial customs also changed. At first, people tried to maintain proper funerals, but the sheer number of deaths overwhelmed them. In Florence, pits were dug where hundreds of bodies were buried together. In London, the ground around churches rose higher and higher as layer after layer of burials were added. In places where coffins ran out, bodies were wrapped in sheets and lowered into the earth as quickly as possible. The rituals of mourning, so important to families, were swept away by necessity. Even after the worst passed in 1351, the plague never truly disappeared. Outbreaks returned again and again for centuries. In 1665, London suffered another great plague, killing over 100,000 people in just 1 year. Every generation lived with the fear that it might return. And in fact, it still exists today, though modern antibiotics can cure it. For medieval people, though, such knowledge was beyond imagining. For them, the Black Death was both mystery and apocalypse. The psychological scars were immense. Survivors lived in a world where entire villages had vanished, where ghost towns dotted the landscape. Families were broken, children left orphaned, communities scarred forever. Folklore and superstition flourished in the wake of the plague. Tales of omens, wandering spirits, and divine wrath were whispered in the dark. To survive the Black Death was to live in a transformed world, haunted by memory. And yet, out of the devastation came resilience. Fields were eventually tilled again, towns rebuilt, and life went on. Human beings, fragile though they are, adapted and endured. The Black Death was a catastrophe, but it was also a turning point. It reshaped economies, shifted societies, and changed how people thought about life, death, and faith. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine a medieval village at dusk. The streets are quiet, the air heavy, and the sound of a church bell carries across the fields. Yet beyond the silence, there is endurance. For those who lived through the plague, the world was never the same, but life continued. Children laughed again, crops grew again, and slowly hope returned. The Black Death reminds us of the fragility of life, but also of the strength hidden within survival. From the silence of plague-stricken villages, let us now step into a different kind of quiet. Not the fearful stillness of empty streets, but the ordered silence of devotion, discipline, and prayer. Tonight, we enter the walls of a medieval monastery, where life was not ruled by kings or lords, but by bells, rituals, and the pursuit of God. Imagine yourself walking through the great wooden gates of a monastery in the 12th century. The air feels cooler, calmer. Beyond the gates lies a self-contained world, built of stone and shaped by centuries of tradition. Every monastery was laid out with care. At the center stood the church, tall and solemn, where the monks gathered 7 times a day to chant prayers. Around it stretched the cloister, a square walkway with open arches, enclosing a garden where herbs grew in tidy rows. The cloister was the beating heart of monastic life, a place for meditation, reading, and quiet reflection. From the cloister branched other rooms, each with its purpose. There was the dormitory, a long hall where the monks slept side by side on narrow wooden beds. There was the refectory, the dining hall, where meals were taken in silence while a single monk read aloud from scripture. The chapter house was where monks gathered to discuss business, confess faults, and make decisions for the community. The scriptorium was the workshop of words, where scribes copied manuscripts by candlelight, their quills scratching steadily across parchment. And of course, there were storerooms, kitchens, workshops, and sometimes even infirmaries and guest houses. A monastery was more than a place of worship. It was a village in miniature, complete with its own rules, rhythms, and responsibilities. The daily life of a monk was governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, a guide written in the 6th century that spread across Europe. Its motto was simple: ora et labora, pray and work. The day began before dawn. At the first sound of the bell, the monks rose from their beds and gathered in the dark, cold church for matins, the night prayer. The chanting of psalms echoed in the stillness, voices rising and falling in haunting harmony. As the sun rose, lauds was sung, welcoming the new day. Prayer divided the hours. Prime came in the morning, followed by terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline before sleep. Between these times, monks worked. Some tilled fields, planting grain, or tending vineyards. Others cared for sheep, cows, or fish ponds. Some worked in kitchens baking bread, brewing ale, or cooking vegetables grown in monastic gardens. Silence was valued, so meals and labor were often done quietly, broken only by necessary speech or simple hand signals. In the scriptorium, scribes bent over desks, copying Bibles, prayer books, and classical texts. Without them, works of Aristotle, Virgil, and countless others might have been lost. Each manuscript took months or even years to complete. Illuminated initials glowed with gold leaf, while careful lines of ink preserved wisdom for the future. These monks, in their silence, became the guardians of knowledge. Food in the monastery was simple, but it had its rhythm too. Meat was often forbidden, except for the sick, so meals were built around bread, beans, vegetables, and fish. On feast days, the tables might be graced with cheese, honey, or wine from the monastery's own vineyards. Ale was common, brewed to be nourishing and safe to drink. Fasting was a regular part of the calendar, with long periods of abstinence, reminding monks that even eating should be done in humility. Not all monasteries were alike. Benedictines, the largest order, valued stability and community. The Cistercians sought a stricter life of simplicity, building their houses in remote valleys and emphasizing manual labor. Franciscans and Dominicans, though technically friars rather than monks, brought the spirit of monastic discipline into towns and cities, preaching among the people. Each order had its own focus, but all shared the rhythm of prayer and devotion. Monasteries were not just spiritual sanctuaries. They were also hubs of charity. They gave alms to the poor, fed travelers, and cared for the sick. Monks grew medicinal herbs, sage, chamomile, lavender, and prepared remedies for those in need. In some places, monastic hospitals became the only source of care for miles around. For peasants, a monastery was often the one place where they could find shelter, bread, or medicine. Yet monasteries could also be powerful. Over centuries, many became wealthy landowners, controlling vast estates. They collected rents from peasants, traded in markets, and stored riches in their treasuries. Some abbots wielded as much influence as nobles or bishops, sitting in councils with kings. This wealth brought criticism. Reformers accused monks of hypocrisy, straying from their vows of poverty. Rivalries broke out between monasteries, or between monasteries and local lords, over land and privileges. Even popes and kings tried to control them, recognizing their political value. Still, for the monks inside, the routine rarely changed. At sunset, they gathered for vespers, chanting as the light faded through stained glass windows. Then came Compline, the final prayer of the day. The church grew quiet, the candles were extinguished, and silence settled over the stone corridors. The monks walked back to their dormitory, where they lay on simple beds, waiting for the next bell to ring. Some monasteries became famous. In Ireland, monks at Kells created one of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts in history, the Book of Kells, its pages filled with intricate patterns and brilliant colors. In France, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux led the Cistercian movement, shaping not just monasteries, but the very heart of medieval spirituality. Across Europe, monasteries became centers of pilgrimage, scholarship, and devotion, their influence stretching far beyond their walls. At night, imagine yourself walking through the cloister of one of these monasteries. The moonlight filters through the arches. The herb garden is fragrant with rosemary and mint. Somewhere, a fountain trickles softly. The world outside may be noisy, chaotic, or violent, but within these walls, time moves slowly, measured by bells and prayer. The monk's devotion may seem distant to us now, but their persistence preserved knowledge, tended the sick, and created small islands of peace in a restless world. As you drift toward sleep, picture the hush of the monastery at midnight, the faint smell of beeswax candles, the stone floors cool beneath your feet. Life here was not easy, nor was it free, but it was steady, ordered, and meant to bring the soul closer to the divine. And whether one agrees with their path or not, their legacy still lingers in libraries, cathedrals, and the quiet memory of their chants carried across centuries. After the quiet chants of the monastery, let us open a door to a very different world, the world of the Vikings. When we picture Vikings, we often imagine horned helmets, raiding ships, and endless battles. But the truth is more nuanced and perhaps more surprising. Beyond the sagas of war and conquest, most Vikings spent their lives not as warriors, but as farmers, traders, craftsmen, and family members. Tonight, we will wander gently through the rhythms of Viking daily life to see what it was really like to live in that northern world 1,000 years ago. Imagine a small Viking settlement along a fjord in Norway. The houses are long and narrow, built from timber with thatched or turf roofs. Inside, there is a single large room, warmed by a central hearth. Families live together, parents, children, and sometimes servants or extended kin. At night, everyone slept on benches or straw beds along the walls, the fire in the center casting flickering shadows. Privacy was rare, but the warmth and security of community mattered more than solitude. The Viking day began early. Men and women both worked hard, for survival demanded it. Farming was the backbone of society. Despite the rocky soil and short growing season, Vikings grew barley, oats, and rye, which they used to bake bread and brew ale. They raised cattle, pigs, goats, and especially sheep, whose wool provided clothing. Fishing was vital too, with nets cast into the cold waters of the North Atlantic. In summer, men hunted deer and seals, while women milked cows and churned butter. Life was full of labor, but it followed the natural rhythm of the seasons. Clothing was practical, but could also be beautiful. Men wore tunics and trousers, often belted at the waist. Women wore long dresses, fastened at the shoulders with brooches. Wool was the main fabric, but linen was also used, and furs kept people warm in winter. Jewelry was common, even among ordinary folk. Silver arm rings, bronze brooches, and glass beads. These were not just ornaments, but signs of status and wealth. Skilled craftsmen shaped metal, bone, and amber into intricate designs, proof that Viking culture valued artistry as much as strength. Mealtimes were simple but hearty. A typical meal might include porridge, fish, bread, and stews made from root vegetables and meat. Ale was the drink of choice. While wealthier households might enjoy mead, a honey-based drink reserved for feasts. These feasts were important occasions where families gathered with neighbors, stories were told, and songs were sung. In long houses lit by fire and torchlight, the skalds, Viking poets, recited tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors, weaving words into memory. Religion shaped much of Viking life. The Old Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, and many others, were not distant figures, but living presences in the stories, rituals, and hopes of the people. Offerings were made at household altars or sacred groves, asking for good harvests, protection at sea, or fertility. Seasonal festivals marked the turning of the year, such as Yule in winter or midsummer celebrations with bonfires. Death was not an end, but a passage, whether to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, or to quieter realms like Hell, where most souls went. Burial customs varied. Some were placed in simple graves, others in ship burials with weapons, jewelry, or even sacrificed animals, symbolizing a journey to the afterlife. Trade was another cornerstone of Viking society. Though they are often remembered as raiders, Vikings were also skilled merchants. Ships carried goods from Scandinavia to the markets of England, Ireland, France, and as far as Constantinople and Baghdad. They traded furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves in exchange for silver, silk, wine, and spices. Archaeological finds show scales and weights, proof of careful commercial practice. In this way, Viking settlements were linked into a global web of exchange, their horizons stretching far beyond their fjords. Daily chores were balanced by a sense of law and order. The Vikings had assemblies called things, where free men gathered to settle disputes, make decisions, and enforce justice. Laws were memorized and recited by officials known as law speakers. Punishments ranged from fines and exile to, in extreme cases, execution. But surprisingly, the system emphasized compensation and negotiation rather than constant violence. Viking society, though harsh, was not lawless. Children grew up quickly. From a young age, they learned the skills of survival. Boys practiced with wooden swords or bows, while girls learned weaving, cooking, and household management. Yet roles were not as rigid as one might think. Women could own property, inherit wealth, and manage farms in their husband's absence. Some even joined expeditions, and sagas tell of women who fought as warriors. The Vikings valued strength and capability, whether in men or women. Evenings brought a different rhythm. After work was done, families gathered around the hearth. Stories were told, runes carved, and songs sung. These oral traditions carried history, myth, and memory across generations. In these moments, the Viking world was not just one of war and hardship, but of warmth, laughter, and imagination. As you picture this life, Think of a quiet Viking village under the northern stars. Smoke rises gently from longhouses. The sea laps against the shore, and children chase each other through the dusk. Inside the halls, firelight flickers on carved wooden beams, and voices carry the old tales into the night. It was a life of struggle, yes, but also of endurance, community, and pride. The secrets of Viking daily life remind us that history is not only about battles and conquests. It is about the ordinary people who tilled fields, raised families, and passed down stories. Their world was hard, but it was rich in meaning. And as we listen to their echoes tonight, we see them not as distant raiders from a legend, but as men and women who, like us, sought warmth, safety, and belonging in a vast and unpredictable world. We have come to the end of our long journey tonight, a journey through centuries of struggle, ambition, hardship, and hope. Along the way, we've met bakers, emperors, monks, warriors, and families who lived in worlds very different from ours, and yet strangely familiar. Their daily lives, their fears, their dreams, they echo across the centuries, reaching us here as you prepare to rest. Think back to the baker in Victorian England, rising before dawn to knead dough in a cold kitchen. He worked with white flour laced with alum, a toxic powder added to make bread look pure and perfect. The people who bought it never knew that what seemed like nourishment carried a slow poison. For the baker, it was simply work, but it was also a deadly burden. His story reminds us how ordinary jobs could hide dangers that shaped entire societies. Now picture Julius Caesar striding across the marble streets of Rome. His ambition built an empire, but it also ended with knives in the Senate. Around him were senators, soldiers, and citizens, each carrying their own small struggles, their own dreams. His story is not only about power, but about the fragility of human ambition. Even the greatest can fall, and the hum of daily life continues without them. Then we looked at the Olympic Games of ancient Greece, where athletes gathered to run, wrestle, and throw under the gaze of the gods. For them, victory was glory, but for the crowds, it was spectacle, a chance to gather and celebrate. Behind the contests was a world of city-states, of farmers and artisans who lived far from the stadium, but whose labor made those games possible. Even the grandest events were built upon the backs of ordinary people. We moved to Florence, where the Medici family rose from bankers to rulers. Their wealth bought art, beauty, and influence, reshaping the Renaissance. Yet their story too is tangled with risk, political enemies, assassinations, shifting alliances. Their success shows us how power can be dazzling, but also precarious. Beneath the palaces, the common citizens lived with their own worries, hunger, disease, and survival. And then we stepped inside the stone walls of monasteries. There, life was measured not by kings or wars, but by bells that called men to prayer. The monks lived in silence, preserving books, brewing ale, healing the sick. In their quiet dedication, they shaped the world more than they ever knew. Each page copied by candlelight was an act of memory against the darkness of forgetting. Finally, we sat in the longhouses of Vikings, where firelight danced on timber beams and families gathered to share food and stories. We learned that most were not raiders, but farmers, fishermen, and traders. Their world was hard, their winters long, yet they found meaning in feasts, poetry, and law. Even in their fierce and restless culture, there was warmth, laughter, and care for kin. When we place these stories side by side, a pattern emerges. Across time and place, people endured hardship. Some faced poison in their bread, others struggled through war or plague. Some rose to power, others lived in quiet obscurity. But all shared the same human search for safety, dignity, and belonging. Think of how different your world is tonight. You rest in comfort, listening to these words, while those who lived centuries ago slept on straw beds, under smoky rafters, or on the hard ground. They dreamed of warmth and safety, just as you do now. The details have changed, but the longing is the same. History often seems like a story of battles, kings, and empires. But when told slowly, in the quiet of the night, it becomes something else. It becomes a tapestry of lives. The baker's hands dusted with flour, the monk's quill scratching across parchment, the Viking mother tending her fire. These are the threads that truly shape history, not always visible, but always present. As you drift toward sleep, let those threads surround you. Imagine the faint glow of a monastery candle, the soft creak of a Viking ship on the water, or the hum of a Roman market fading into twilight. Let the voices of the past grow softer until they blend with your own breathing, steady and calm. You have walked tonight through centuries of struggle, but now it is time to rest. History will keep turning its pages while you sleep. Tomorrow, new stories will wait. But for now, close your eyes, let go of the day, and sink gently into peace. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Good night, and sleep well.